Well, you have no idea what a thrill it is for us to be able to introduce Eve Burton, be part of celebrating her career commitment to press freedom. We had, as Lance and I got here tonight, we had a chance to see a lot of the old Hearst folks who we spent a lot of time with, and folks from the Reporters Committee who thanked us for being here. And our response was the same, like, what are you talking about? We're so grateful to be here. We're the ones who are lucky to be able to have this moment to introduce Eve. And of course, if any of you know Eve, you also know that you can't possibly say no to Eve. So, like, whether we wanted to be here or not, we were going to be here. Lance and I experienced firsthand the true force of nature that Eve is. She changed and shaped our lives in ways we're never going to be able to forget, and really never be able to repay. Of course, she's been championing the press for decades. When Eve became general counsel at the New York Daily News in the mid-'90s, management made the radical and not entirely popular move of placing her in the newsroom. Reporters and editors, some of them fretted that Eve would be an obstacle to their work, and instead she was a potent resource, pushing forward investigations, fighting for public records and increased media access, getting family court open to the media, as she told me earlier tonight, perhaps her most proud moment around First Amendment. She sued the city of New York, Mayor Giuliani, 20 times at least. I read a quote from Joe Calderon, who was the chief of investigations at the Daily News, who said something to the effect of, previously, any time a lawyer had been in the newsroom, he would be running the other way or hoping they weren't coming towards him. Eve was the first and only lawyer he looked forward to seeing. When it was announced that Eve was leaving the Daily News for CNN, the special counsel for Mayor Giuliani said, "Let's just say I'm very thrilled CNN is located in Atlanta." Nowhere, though, has Eve's zealous defense of the First Amendment been more evident than in the battle that she waged on our behalf. At the San Francisco Chronicle, we were covering a federal grand jury probe into the use of illegal performance-enhancing drugs by some of the world's greatest athletes. In 2004, the Chronicle published a series of stories based on the testimony of those athletes, stories that laid bare the pervasiveness of steroids in sports and prompted a national public health discussion about their dangers. Our work was almost universally celebrated. We were even commended for performing a service by then-President George W. Bush, a huge baseball fan and once the part owner of the Texas Rangers. Yet in the spring of 2006, Bush's own Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales, approved subpoenas that demanded we reveal the source of our stories. These subpoenas threatened to put us in prison for 18 months if we didn't comply. Of course, we had no intention of complying, but make no mistake, we were worried. Enter Eve.
You know, there really isn't any protection for reporters and whistleblowers when you get over to federal court. We so need a federal shield law, and until we get them, if you find yourself in that situation, you face long odds. That's what Eve was up against after she agreed to take Mark and me as her clients in the case. For the next 8 months, she worked day and night to protect the First Amendment values that were at issue in our case, and not incidentally, to get us reporters out of the jam we found ourselves in. Now, we know she worked those long hours because Eve is into client contact. She would phone us at all hours to tell us the latest, the thinking behind the legal briefs and strategies of John Donnellan and the legal team, the scope and intensity of the congressional lobbying effort, the case's politics and personalities, and always her latest great idea, the newest angle she was working in hopes of getting us out of the trouble we were in, of allowing us to keep our promises to our sources and yet avoid federal prison. And in the end, she prevailed, really through great enterprise and tremendous force of will, she made the government do what they're always supposed to do in source cases, but never do. Do your own investigation of your security and secrecy concerns. Don't just squeeze the reporters. But she made them do it, and so the day came when the government announced that through their own means they had identified a source of our stories, and the prosecutor said they really didn't need our testimony anymore, so they were going to drop the subpoenas, and then the judge vacated the prison sentences, and we were free because of Eve Burton. So now, Mark and I always say to reporters, if you ever get jammed up, dragged into a source case, have somebody reach out to Eve Burton at Hearst. She has a million ideas. She is a reporter's truest friend, and it is great to be able to publicly say how much we thank you, your efforts on behalf of us and of all reporters every place. Thanks so much, Eve. Now we have a video from Mr. Frank Bennick of Hearst.
Good evening. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you tonight, but I hope you'll indulge me for a few minutes anyway, because I have something important to say. They say that behind every good reporter is a good editor. It's usually the editors who say that, to tell the truth. I know a few reporters who might beg to differ. Anyway, I think it's true. But here's something you don't hear as often. Behind every good editor, there's a good lawyer. And I think that's more than true. And you know what? We are lucky to have one of the very best. Eve Burton came to Hearst by way of CNN. From the very start, she always said that her team's goal was to support the greater good of our company. But she also made it clear that achieving that greater good meant standing for something more, something beyond Hearst. That's a free press. And that free speech itself is the bedrock on which you build a democratic society. We have some very brave reporters in this room tonight, and some very brave editors. But let's take a moment to thank a woman who allows us to be brave by giving us the power, the weaponry, the strategy, and above all, the legal and moral standing to fight the good fight. So who is Eve Burton? Let me tell you. In one of the country's most publicized cases in professional sports, when Mark and Lance broke the Balco steroid scandal in 2004, Eve and her team fought fearlessly to protect their sources as they faced a federal subpoena and 18 months in jail for contempt. The order was later dropped. In the case of Capital Newspapers versus Bruno and Silver, when New York's elected officials were secretly spending millions of taxpayer dollars on pet projects, the Albany Times Union sued to get the truth and won. That was Eve and her team. And when Esquire magazine published a blog that satirized one of those birther books about President Obama, the book's author sued and lost. The winner was Esquire. But the real winner was the concept of satire itself. That was Eve and her team. We're all grateful for Eve because in the end, we are all better at what we do because she is so good at what she does for all of us. Not just those of us at Hearst, but all of us who labor at the honorable task of shining light into dark places. So thank you all for giving me a few minutes of your time. In closing, I'd like to add my congratulations to the incomparable Tom Brokaw and the brilliant team from the Knight Foundation, Alberto and Eric. And Eve, thank you. Keep up the good work and keep telling the truth.
Ladies and gentlemen, Eve Burton.
not going to do Balco again, right? We're not going to do Balco again. Thank you, Mark and Lance, and thank you, Reporters Committee, for what you do for journalists every single day. And thank you, Tim Armstrong and Lee Bollinger, for being the chairs of this dinner. And to Alberto and Eric and Tom, I want you to know what a privilege it is for this First Amendment lawyer and her team to be honored in your company. As Lance and Mark made clear, the First Amendment is a team sport. So I've brought my team. It's a team I've played with for many years, and you guys are the true champions of the First Amendment. It doesn't happen alone. As everyone knows, even those who practice corporate law at Hearst, a criteria for being hired in the Office of General Counsel is a devotion to the amendment. So I'd like to ask my team to please stand so I can thank them. Love that, Frank Bennick. I wanted to start with a Balco story, and it in fact involved Frank Bennick. In our darkest days, after Lance and Mark were sentenced to 18 months in jail, and we'd appealed and had kept them out of jail pending that appeal, the government came to Hearst in a very dark day and told us that if the company did not produce the confidential information, which they understood we had, we would be held in contempt as a company. The cost of the contempt was $180 million based on grand jury rules. Frank, at that point, was our executive chairman and well known to many in this room, the giant he is. And he supported us to keep pushing, even in the light of this fine. He said, and I quote, "This is the risk we take as part of being a great media company." Steve Schwartz, our present CEO, would have said the same thing. One was a publisher, the other was a journalist. They understood the playing field extremely well. And by affirming these first principles for us, our team was free to power on. And this, along with Lance and Mark, staying together and staying with us, allowed us all to win. As I said, the First Amendment is a team sport. The First Amendment is also like a muscle. It has to be exercised. As Lee Bollinger said, the First Amendment exists only in theory without a constituency of support. And every single one of you here, whether you're a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, a Cub reporter, a lawyer, those who've argued some of the most important Supreme Court cases under the First Amendment, and the executives who have supported the mission, which is expensive, have all been part of protecting free speech. Even some in the government have been constituents. Our present Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, surprising to some of you, has long been someone who does appreciate the First Amendment. She and I have found ourselves with common ground in very difficult circumstances over the years. So take some heart, hopefully. People in that position sometimes change their views when they get there, but she has the right instincts. At Hearst, we have a dedicated commitment to keeping the doors of government open and information flowing to our readers and our viewers. Our newspapers and our mobile websites now reach 80 million readers daily. Our television stations reach about 20% of all Americans. Our magazines reach 58% of the US population and millions more globally. Team Hearst's efforts on behalf of the amendment is often not sexy. It doesn't get reported, but it is important and enduring. In the last 18 months, for example, our First Amendment lawyers at Hearst have fielded nearly 300 separate access to information requests from our television and newspaper newsrooms across the country. The breadth of these requests and reporting scope is staggering. It's still alive and well. From police departments that refuse to give out use of force data, to military officials who resist every attempt to bring transparency to their court proceedings, to courts that block the docket from public view, and to government agencies that shield all aspects of the work they perform in the name of the public. Our journalists send us roughly 4 new requests a week, and I'm honored to say, and with great thanks, that many of those journalists are here tonight, having traveled very far to be with us, and I thank them. Let's look to the future. The First Amendment has a number of great challenges, as Alberto has outlined, but let's touch on 2. First, there are new players in the ecosystem. Our West Coast colleagues at Google, Microsoft, and Apple, who I thank for being here tonight. I think that's noteworthy in and of itself. The world is changing, as well as AOL here in New York, as Tim said, are not immune from the difficulties in balancing civil liberties under the First Amendment, from the pressures as recent history has shown. Our technology colleagues did not grow up in the same puddles as we did. We learned what it meant to be wet and sinking in that water. We won cases. We developed the law. They've not grown up with that same history and the cost of hard-won cases. We need to have a cultural mesh so that the country can speak the same language when it comes to the First Amendment. Second, our great First Amendment bar and journalists once had a social contract with the government, in which I mean there was a cushion of tolerance between the executive branch and the press that allowed for conversations on difficult topics. We all had rights that we never used out of respect and restraint. The government did not prosecute always or push for full disclosure. The press would give a second thought to publishing when asked in rare times where security or safety were critical. That room to maneuver is now gone. So we need to pivot. We need to find new answers and new thinking. The traditional media companies of the East and the new media companies of the West, and they are media companies, or said differently, culture and code need to work together on new standards, a new social contract, and a new respect for the strengths that each of us bring and need to bring to the protection of the First Amendment in the coming century. But meanwhile, tonight, let's celebrate the latest force for good by supporting the Columbia University Knight Institute that will give the world access to the 99% of the government information that we know we are all entitled to. We mostly fight about the 1%. So let's celebrate the 99%, whether it's bringing sunshine to the family courts, as the Daily News did, or uncovering corruption in sports, as Mark and Lance did so brilliantly, or opening up Gore versus Bush, as CNN did. The Knight Institute and the Reporters Committee will champion the next chapter that will keep the constitutional muscle toned and ready for the next challenge. That is critical. That's the 99%. And a final note, if I may, of gratitude to those who've joined me on my First Amendment journey. As you all know, I'm not easy. To Karen, affectionately known to everyone at Hearst as the boss. And to my family, which gives new meaning to being part of a tribe, to Kat and Ed and her 15 brothers from another mother, as well as her brother Kyle from that same mother, me. Thank you all for getting dressed, wearing a tie, and getting here on time tonight. That's the most amazing thing that's happened tonight. And most importantly, to my husband, John. A Shakespeare scholar, you may not know, a teacher of English in the South Bronx, where access has another meaning, and there is really something for our country to worry about, and that is true poverty, and less of a way out to a different life. John, thanks for being my bestie. Good night.